Okay, picture this. A god dies, but he isn't just killed, right? He's violently torn apart, or maybe drowned, or even stabbed by someone he deeply trusted. After that, his body completely disappears, gone. But then, a few days later, he comes back. And we're not talking about returning as a ghost or some fleeting spirit here. He comes back entirely, 100% alive.
Now, here's the part that should genuinely kind of creep you out. That exact story, it isn't just from one culture. We're seeing it pop up across ancient civilizations that literally had zero contact with each other. We're talking different gods, completely different names, but the exact same plot. So either all these ancient people magically copied each other across vast oceans and centuries, or something much deeper is going on. Welcome to This Explainer, where we are going to unravel a massive, absolutely fascinating historical mystery. 4. That is the sheer number of completely separate, isolated cultures we're looking at today. We've got Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, and Scandinavia. I really want you to just think about the sheer impossibility of 4 entirely distinct civilizations independently inventing the exact same mythological plotline. I mean, it completely defies statistical logic. How on earth do you get the identical narrative blueprint in the scorching deserts of Egypt and the freezing landscapes of Scandinavia? Okay, let's dive into this with case 1 and 2, Egypt and Greece. Let's start with the clearest version of this pattern over in Egypt, and then we'll contrast it with an older Greek myth. First up, we have Osiris. He was Egypt's king of the living world, while his brother Set grew fiercely jealous, right? So he tricks Osiris into a coffin at a party, seals it shut, and literally throws it into the Nile to drown him. But Set doesn't stop there. He finds the body later, cuts it into tiny pieces, and scatters them all across Egypt. Wild, right? But Osiris's wife, Isis, spends years tracking down every single piece and uses magic to reassemble him and bring him back to life. Now let's jump over to Greece. We usually think of Dionysus as the fun god of wine and festivals, but in an older myth, he was the son of Zeus. Zeus's jealous wife, Hera, wanted the kid gone, so she sends the Titans to lure baby Dionysus in with toys and mirrors, and then they tear him apart, limb from limb, and devour him. Horrifying, I know, but his heart survived, and from that one tiny fragment, he was magically restored to life, completely reborn as a god of resurrection and ecstatic ritual. So the absolutely crucial point here is this repeating sequence: death, dismemberment, and resurrection. In both of these cases, the god doesn't just barely survive. They are violently torn apart, magically reassembled, and then reborn as something significantly greater. Osiris became the ruler of the underworld, which is the very reason ancient Egyptians believed death wasn't actually the end. And Dionysus, he returned completely changed, having literally conquered mortality itself. Sound familiar? Keep this exact shape in your head, because we are far from done. Moving right along to case 3, Inanna of Mesopotamia. Let's travel even further back in time, all the way to ancient Sumer. Here we meet Inanna, the incredibly powerful goddess of love and war, who decides to descend into the underworld to visit her sister. But you really have to notice the grueling structure of her journey here. The underworld had this one absolute, unbreakable rule: everyone who enters must pass through 7 gates. And at every single gate, Inanna was forced to give up something: a piece of her divine clothing, a fraction of her power. She's systematically stripped down step by step until she arrives at that final date with absolutely nothing. She is utterly defenseless. And the moment she arrives, her sister has her killed. Her lifeless body was literally hung on a hook and left to rot. For 3 days, she was completely dead. But then, through the intervention of some other gods, she was finally revived and allowed to return to the living world. Though, to be fair, she did have to provide a replacement in the land of the dead. But look at that pattern. 3 days, death, return. A sacrifice made in exchange for resurrection. I want you to really think about this for a second. Where else have you heard of a 3-day resurrection? If that echoes a much later religious tradition for you, you absolutely aren't imagining it. Scholars have been poring over these exact parallels for well over a century. All right, let's move on and see how this builds in case 4, Baldr of Scandinavia. Travel way up north into Norse mythology, and we meet Baldr. This is a god so beloved that his mother actually made every single object in existence swear a magical oath to never, ever hurt him. He was completely invincible. Well, except for one tiny little plant she thought was just too harmless to bother with: mistletoe. And of course, the trickster god Loki found out about this loophole. So Loki crafts this little dart out of mistletoe and cruelly tricks Baldr's blind brother into throwing it at him during a game. Baldr is struck and he dies instantly. The other gods are just devastated. They send a messenger straight to the underworld to beg for his release. The ruler of the dead actually agreed, but she laid down this impossible condition. Every single being in the universe must weep for him. And you know what? It almost worked, until one creature, who was actually just Loki in disguise, flat out refused to cry.
Which brings us to this timeline. As you'll see, the Norse myths actually tweaks the ancient formula just a bit. At the 1-minute mark, Baldr dies instantly from the mistletoe. Over the next 3 days, the gods desperately beg the underworld for his release. But because Loki sabotaged that weeping condition, Baldr doesn't come back immediately. He stays in the underworld. His resurrection is actually pushed all the way to a future epic, Ragnarok. That's the prophesied end of the world, where he's destined to return and help rule a reborn, restored universe. So the pattern completely holds. You have death, and you have the underworld holding the key to resurrection, but the timeline is just stretched all the way to the end of days.
So, what does this all mean? Let's look at 3 theories of resurrection.
So we've established the what. We have seen the exact same narrative structure completely dominate the mythologies of these seemingly disconnected ancient worlds. Now we really need to pivot to the why. Why does this happen? Historians fiercely debate this, but we're going to look at the facts impartially. Here are the 3 dominant theories. Theory 1 points to the seasons. Think about it. Ancient agricultural societies constantly watch their crops die every winter and then miraculously return every spring. A resurrection myth is a very natural way to explain and find comfort in that cycle, right? Osiris, for instance, was very closely tied to the annual flooding and receding of the Nile River. Theory 2 focuses on human psychology. Every single human on Earth faces the exact same terrifying reality, the finality of death. So a myth where even a god can die and return, that is a deeply, universally comforting idea.
But perhaps the most compelling explanation is Theory 3, the shared ancestry of ideas. And this brilliantly illustrates how the ancient world wasn't quite as isolated as we think. We often assume these cultures were completely disconnected, but trade routes connected these regions so much more than we realize. Mesopotamia influenced Egypt. Egypt had contact with Greece, and Greece had contact with the Norse world through centuries of slow migration and trade. Even without direct, documented contact between the furthest endpoints, stories travel right alongside people. Human migration and trade networks acted like ancient information highways, allowing this core narrative to slowly migrate and adapt to brand new climates and cultures.
Ultimately, the truth is probably a combination of all 3 theories. But the real takeaway here is profoundly beautiful. We so often dismiss ancient myths as just primitive stories that uneducated people told before they understood science. But when completely separate civilizations independently arrive at the exact same emotional and narrative answer to death, well, that isn't primitive at all. That is humanity universally grappling with its hardest, most terrifying problem, our own mortality. They were actively working out the concept of hope over and over again in literally every corner of the world.
So, I want to leave you with this question. Which version of the story hit you the hardest? Was it the brutal dismemberment of Osiris, the systematic stripping away of Inanna's power, or the tragic trickery used against Baldr? Take a moment to think about how these ancient echoes still resonate in the movies and stories we tell today. And hey, if you found Baldr's delayed return fascinating, keep an eye out for an upcoming deep dive into Ragnarok, where we'll explore exactly what happens when that future epoch finally arrives. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.